Skeletal muscle cells are called muscle fibers, and that's because they are long and cylindrical. So if we look here, this right here is a single muscle cell, or what we would call a muscle fiber. So the term muscle fiber and muscle cell are used interchangeably. So we've got one muscle fiber here, a second one here, a third one here, a fourth one, etc., etc. Now, if we were to look at these as skeletal muscle tissue underneath the microscope, we would maybe be able to see striations, and you can kind of see them. They're very faint, but striations are these stripes. And these stripes are due to the proteins called actin and myosin, and these proteins are involved in actually making the muscle contract and get shorter. And we'll talk about that mechanism a little bit later. But in general, histology and cellular structures associated with muscles have the prefixes of either sarco or myo. So here are some examples. So just like we call a muscle cell a muscle fiber, it gets a special name because it has a special structure and function. So the different organelles and structures associated with the skeletal muscle fiber also gets some special names. So for example, the sarcolemma is just another name for the cell membrane, but it's the cell membrane of a skeletal muscle cell. The sarcoplasm is the cytoplasm of a skeletal muscle cell. And the sarcoplasmic reticulum, you could probably guess, is the endoplasmic reticulum of a skeletal muscle cell. So if we look at this picture here, so this right here is a single muscle cell or fiber. And then this is just a small portion inside the skeletal muscle cell. So the sarcolemma is the cell membrane surrounding the skeletal muscle cell here. The sarcoplasm is the goo or the cytoplasm inside the cell. And then the sarcoplasmic reticulum is the endoplasmic reticulum that is associated with each one of these myofibrils. And the sarcoplasmic reticulum in skeletal muscle fibers has a very kind of a specialized function in that it stores and releases calcium ions. And this calcium helps, or it's vitally important for muscle contractions. So when a muscle needs to contract, the sarcoplasmic reticulum can release that calcium, and then as the muscle relaxes, the sarcoplasmic reticulum can take that calcium back in and store it until the next time the muscle cell needs to contract. Now, let's take another look at another thing or another structure called the triad. And so this is the sarcolemma. So this is the cell membrane of a skeletal muscle fiber. And you'll notice these little indentations here on the surface. Well, these indentations are actually the cell membrane, the sarcolemma, actually sticking down into the interior of the muscle cell itself. So it's sticking down into the sarcoplasm. And then you'll notice that on either side of this, this is called a T-tubule, by the way. On either side of the T-tubule, you have your sarcoplasmic reticulum. So you've got some here and on this side. And so this structure, which consists of the T-tubule and the two sarcoplasmic reticula, is called a triad. And this triad is important because the stimulus for a skeletal muscle to contract travels along the sarcolemma, but that signal has to be able to travel deep down into the cell to actually cause the contraction to happen in these smaller structures here. So that signal is able to travel along the sarcolemma and then deep down into the cell through this triad structure. Now, if we go back a slide, so here is our skeletal muscle cell, and then packed within the skeletal muscle cell are the myofibrils. So let's take a look at those myofibrils and myofilaments a little bit more in depth. So each one of these here is a myofibril. And then if we zoom in even smaller, so if we take a closer look to the at the myofibril, we'll see these even smaller structures called myofilaments. So this is a single myofibril that's been kind of zoomed in. And then these little structures right here, so we've got the green lines here and the purple lines here. These are the myofilaments. And the myofilaments are the proteins that are actually involved in making a muscle contract. And the names of those myofilaments are actin and myosin. And you'll notice that we have these little Z-like structures here. These are called Z-discs. And so the actin and the myosin are arranged in structures called sarcomeres. And a sarcomere is just the region between two Z-discs. Now, the sarcomeres are the actual functional contractile unit of a muscle fiber. So the muscle fiber contracts because the sarcomeres contract. So let's take a closer look at the anatomy of a sarcomere. So once again, we're kind of zooming in on our picture here. And if we were to take the myofilaments out of the myofibril and look at it a little bit more pulled out here, we can see the different components of the sarcomere. So once again, we've got the green lines here, which are the actin contractile proteins. And then the purple ones here are the myosin. And if we take an even closer look, we can see that myosin is a long protein fiber, and it has these little heads kind of sticking up off of it. They kind of look like feet. And you can see those heads a little bit more in detail here. Now, this structure here, the green, spheres that are making up the actin, that's the green part here. All right, so this is the actin molecule. And we also have some regulatory proteins, because the regulatory proteins regulate when a muscle contracts and when it doesn't. And so the regulatory proteins are attached to actin. So you can see that on actin, the little darker circles here, these are the binding sites for the myosin heads. So when a muscle contracts, the myosin heads can bind to these binding sites on actin and pull actin across the myosin. So during a contraction, the myosin protein doesn't get shorter and the actin protein doesn't get shorter. They just slide across each other so that the entire sarcomere gets shorter. So this Z-disc moves closer to this Z-disc, and it's just because the myosin here bonds to the actin and pulls it across the myosin. Now, our muscles aren't always contracting. At times they need to be able to relax. So tropomyosin is the kind of yellow protein filament that you can see here. It is blocking those binding sites. So as long as tropomyosin is in place, myosin cannot bind to actin. Also attached to tropomyosin is troponin, and troponin is this little protein molecule right here. And so troponin controls where tropomyosin is found. So in this conformation here, the myosin heads can't bind to the sites on actin, but something can come along and bind to troponin, and when it binds to troponin, it moves tropomyosin out of the way. And when tropomyosin is moved out of the way, the binding sites are available so that myosin can bind to the actin and pull it across itself. All right, so just to reiterate, the sarcomere is the area between two Z-discs. Actin, we also call the thin filament because it looks thinner under the microscope, and it's got the binding sites for myosin. Tropomyosin blocks those binding sites unless it gets the signal to unblock those binding sites. And that signal comes from troponin, and troponin reacts to calcium. So what happens to trigger a muscle contraction, an ion of calcium comes in and binds to troponin. When it does that, it changes the conformation of troponin, and troponin pulls on tropomyosin to move the filament out of the way. And once that tropomyosin is moved out of the way, the actin head combined to, or I'm sorry, the myosin head combined to the actin molecule, and it can pull these green proteins across it in order to pull this Z disc closer to this Z disc. In the next video, we're going to take a closer look at all of the different steps that go into making that muscle contraction happen.